In part 1 we visited Kickoff, Player Manager and Kickoff 2, the first 3 games by Dino Dini which set the bar for football games, and established Dino as the name to imitate, even in games magazines where a fake letter attempted to tarnish his reputation and succeeded in this pre-web world, until the fakery was proven and an apology from the editor of Amiga Power was issued. Dino was in demand, Kickoff was in demand, and his rockstar status led him from publisher Anko into the arms of Virgin Games and Richard Branson, where Kickoff 2's successor would now be developed. But the tide was about to turn. Remember these guys from part 1? And then there's the £1,000 gorilla about to throw his hat into the ring. This is the story of Kickoff. Like John Barnes charging down the touchline, the Kickoff brand had momentum, and Anko knew it. Add-ons and ports were released at every opportunity, with everything from European team packs and competition add-ons to a Kickoff 2 based maths quiz, 8-bit home computers, the NES, the Mega Drive, the Game Gear, even the Game Boy got its own version. When asked by Retro Gamer about these add-ons and ports, Dino replied, "It already was a franchise and Anko exploited it in a manner of ways for which I got no reward. I wanted to create a new game that improved upon Kickoff by adding more depth and removing some of the shortcomings of the original game. And it was this which eventually became Goal landed in stores in 1993 for the Amiga, Atari and MS-DOS, with Dino naturally credited as the programmer and his wife Pam credited as the producer. She also gets a hidden message in the code of the Mega Drive version. You old romantic, Dino. Dino's aim was to create a more accessible and forgiving game without losing any of the depth of Kickoff 2. The same contextual type control scheme was applied, familiar to players of Kickoff 2, but inertia was also added to give better control of the player's speed. With practice you could pull off a 180-degree turn, which simply wasn't possible in Kickoff 2. The AI was improved to give a sense that it was more aware of what was going on the entire pitch, rather than just in the player's zone. And the graphics were improved to give a slightly chunkier feel, more detail to the pitch, the players and the surroundings, and it introduced an additional zoomed out view. You could play the whole game zoomed out if you wanted to, but most used the default view which was zoomed in and it would pop out for set pieces, corners, place kicks and throw-ins. There was even an option to play horizontally if you wanted to. While the Amiga was the definitive version, it was also very playable on the Atari ST but suffered from the same graphical limitations as Kickoff 2, and the PC version was also very playable but squeezed into this smaller view box to maintain the frame rate. On the face of it, Goal was a huge improvement over Kickoff 2. It was more accessible for new players and it offered more of a challenge for hardened Kickoff 2 players, running at 30% faster than Kickoff 2 at the hardest level. So surely the gaming press would receive it in that way, and no doubt they would have if it wasn't for 2 words. Sensible Soccer. Crucially released before Goal, it capitalised on the success of the football genre stirred up by Dini. In '91, John Hare of Sensible Software said of Dini he wished he'd written Kickoff because it sold well and it deserved to sell well. Dini's blog, however, on retrospect reads, "I was struggling with what Sensible Software represented. I was struggling with the acclaim that a clone of my game obtained. I was struggling with the negativity thrown at me by those who loved a clone that would never have come to be if it had not been for me. I was struggling with the idea that Sensible Software were a decent game developer who had their own share of success and yet were not satisfied with that and had to invade my turf." Worth remembering at this point perhaps then that it was the same John Hare and same Sensible Software that produced Microprose Soccer before Kickoff 1 in 1988. Dini's crown may have slipped, but I think it's fair to say football was anyone's turf and it could be fought for on more than one front.
Planet Earth. A scientist creates the ultimate machine.
At last!
In just the same way that Dini had ported the original Atari ST Kickoff to the Amiga, he was able to port Goal to the Mega Drive, or Genesis as it's known in the US, which shared the same Motorola CPU. It opened up Goal to a potentially huge international market, and escaped piracy which was rife on the home computers.
Mega Drive from Sega.
The conversion was up to the same usual high standard that you would expect from Dini. He found and used the machine's strengths where possible, and overcame its limitations. For example, the Mega Drive didn't have enough RAM to hold the game sprites. He used a method of direct memory access to stream the sprites to the VRAM. He did this on the fly, and it actually resulted in a higher frame rate than the Amiga version, which had more RAM. This method is what Sega refers to as blast processing, and you'll often hear it cited as a major advantage over the Super Nintendo. Other improvements included a 4-player mode, and players now had the correct skin colour. This was added at the request of publisher Virgin, and it was an interesting design challenge for Dini, who had already exhausted the amount of sprites he could store. He managed to pull it off though by substituting the skin colour on the fly in cache, and without being able to use sprites he had to substitute the boot colour with the skin colour. It was crude, but it worked. There was also a Super Nintendo version of the game, of which Dini had no creative control or input into. In fact, he wasn't happy having his name associated with it. It was dumbed down and it reverted to the very old-fashioned method of the ball sticking to the player's foot. Happy with his conversion and hoping to repeat the success of Kick-Off 2 on the Amiga, Dino Dini's Soccer went out to stores in 1994. Oh yeah, and there was another game that came out on exactly the same day.
FIFA International Soccer for Sega Genesis. If it's in the game, EA Sports, it's in the game.
In the words of Dino, we were done. You can't own success, but the FIFA series has certainly done a good job of it, with over 77 versions released since that day. What it lacked in the raw playability that the Kick-Off series had, it made up for with stunning graphics, sound, real licensed players' names, and as it grew into the monster it's become today, a team of thousands of developers, motion capture, and everything else that goes with it. And that would be the last we'd see of Dino for some time now. But what it didn't stop was Anko trying to milk that Kick-Off brand just a little bit more. Moving on from the original trilogy without Dino was always going to be a difficult task. The man they chose to lead this was Steve Screech, who you may remember from Kick-Off 1 as the sprite designer. Opting for a new isometric view and losing all of the mechanics of the original Kick-Off games, Kick-Off 3 and subsequent update European Challenge was poorly received by the press and players alike, and it would seem Anko themselves had little faith in the product, withholding all review copies of the game until the release date, while accusing the magazines themselves of having links to piracy. Hardly the wisest marketing move. The next 3 games were dragged kicking and screaming into the 3D generation, spearheaded by the PlayStation. Real licensed players' names finally entered the mix, but the series was now gaining a reputation for average review scores, and nothing to offer that FIFA wasn't doing 10 times better. Kick-Off 98 was also known as Kick-Off World and was the first PlayStation game in the Kick-Off series, experienced by many only because of the official PlayStation magazine's demo disc which it featured on, and certainly not in sales numbers. Finally, the very familiar cover of Kick-Off 02 started life as Ultimate Kick-Off with help of an early established Kick-Off association. This was an attempted return to the foundations of Kick-Off. While 3D, it returned primarily to the top-down view, basic controls and speedy gameplay. It sold only 5,000 copies, and with Anko closing its doors in 2003, it would be the last from them and perhaps an opportunity for somebody else to take on the Kick-Off name. While Anko had been pummeling the Kick-Off name, Dino had signed for software houses and even developed a new football game named Soccer 3 and later Total Control Football, but this was cancelled in 2005 and never saw release. In 98 he was credited as the project director for the official England football game 3 Lions, also released as Bomber 98 in Italy, Mondial 98 in Spain, Alexi Lalas International Soccer in the US, Pro Foot Contest 98 in France and Golden Goal in the rest of the world. And please excuse my pronunciation on those. While better received than Anko's efforts, it lacked the signature trademarks of a Dini football game, perhaps diluted by the larger development team needed to develop a PlayStation game at this time. After a period of work as a contractor for a government-funded project, Dini settled in the Netherlands as a lecturer of games programming. In 2010 it was announced on his blog that he was working on a sequel to the game Player Manager, which caused excitement but nothing materialised on the project. It was in October of 2015, however, that Dino Dini was eventually reunited with the Kick-Off name, announcing that now the time was right for an indie developer, which he'd been all along, to create a game for the PlayStation 4 and PlayStation Vita. Dino Dini's Kick-Off Revival would be that game. And so, full circle, with Dini and Kick-Off back together again, this my friends is where we end the story for now. Will Kick-Off Revival rekindle the spirit of those original games? Can it deliver something that the originals didn't? Or is it perhaps time that Dini went back to his original inspirations and showed us something that isn't football? One thing's for sure, I'll be checking out Kick-Off Revival on my channel as soon as I can get my hands on it. So please, if you enjoyed this, like the video, subscribe to my channel and stick around. Take care, Cave Dwellers.